My parents gave everything to my brother and ignored me. But I built an empire from nothing, and now they wish they had noticed me. From the moment I was born, it was as if the world had already decided who would matter and who would be invisible. My brother Adil was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose every smile was celebrated and whose every mistake was forgiven, while I was left in the shadows, a quiet observer of the affection and attention lavished upon him. I remember the first time I realized that my existence was secondary. I must have been 6 or 7, and I had spent weeks crafting a small clay figurine, hoping to surprise my parents. I had imagined the look on their faces, the pride in their eyes when they saw what I had made. I carefully painted it with the colors I loved and waited for the perfect moment to show them. When I finally presented it with trembling hands, my mother smiled politely and my father patted my head, and then they both turned their attention to Adil, who had just finished a school project that was admittedly impressive, but nothing compared to the effort I had poured into my creation. I felt a strange hollow ache inside, a mix of disappointment and confusion, as though I had done something wrong by existing at the same time as him. That day I went to my room and cried quietly against the cold wall, the tears burning my cheeks and yet fueling a quiet fire inside me, a fire that whispered that I could not rely on anyone else to recognize my worth, and that if I wanted to be seen, I would have to make the world notice me on my own. As I grew older, the favoritism became harder to ignore and more painful to bear. Every achievement of mine was met with polite applause or ignored entirely, while Adil's smallest accomplishments were celebrated with loud praise and extravagant gifts. My parents planned trips and outings for him and included me only when convenient or necessary. I remember one summer they sent Adil to a summer camp in Europe, a trip that would shape his social life and give him connections. I was not allowed to go because it was not deemed suitable for a girl. Despite the fact that I had begged and pleaded and promised that I would manage on my own, I watched him leave the airport with their hands waving and smiles glowing, while I stayed behind feeling invisible and unwanted. I had to learn early how to survive in a house where love was rationed unequally and recognition was a scarce commodity. I threw myself into studies and hobbies, into anything that could give me a sense of accomplishment, even if it went unnoticed. I remember spending nights reading in secret, crafting my own stories and learning skills that I was told would never amount to anything. I honed my mind, my body, my creativity in silence, building a foundation that no one acknowledged, but that I knew could one day carry me beyond the shadow of my brother. By the time I was a teenager, the resentment had begun to shape me. It was not hatred, yet it was a sharp awareness of the injustice I endured and the unfairness of life around me. My parents never meant to hurt me, at least I think so, but their eyes always sparkled brighter for Adil, and their words always lingered longer when they spoke to him. I learned to smile politely at their praise when it came my way, to hide the storm of hurt and frustration that brewed beneath the surface. I learned to move silently through the house, making myself small, making myself invisible in order to avoid further disappointment and rejection. Yet I also learned to dream and to imagine a life that was mine alone, where I could be recognized for my talents, my intelligence, my perseverance, a life where I would not be compared to anyone, where I could build something lasting from the ground up. I remember the night my first painting won a national competition. I had poured weeks of effort into it, working late into the night with only the dim light of a desk lamp to guide me. Each brushstroke was a piece of my soul, each color a reflection of my heart. When I received the news, I could barely contain my excitement. I ran to show my parents, hoping that this time they would see me for who I was, that this time they would understand the depth of my dedication and skill. I placed the painting before them, my hands shaking and my heart racing. I watched as they looked at it, their eyes polite, their smiles mild, and then they turned to Adil, who had just returned from a soccer game, and began talking about his performance. The conversation never once touched my achievement. I felt my chest tighten, my vision blur, and I fled to my room, closing the door behind me and letting the tears flow freely. This was a turning point for me, a moment where I realized that waiting for their recognition was futile, that if I wanted to be acknowledged and respected, I would have to create my own path, my own success, independent of their approval. I began to plot quietly, my ambitions forming like steel in my mind. I would leave home one day, I would carve my own destiny, and no one would stand in my way. I remember sitting by my window late at night, watching the city lights flicker in the distance and imagining the life I would lead, a life where my accomplishments would speak for themselves, where my name would be remembered and respected, where I would not be defined by the neglect of my parents or the favoritism they showed my brother. I began working tirelessly in secret, honing skills that no one expected me to master, learning to manage money, to understand business, to communicate effectively, to be strong and independent. I knew it would be a long journey, a path filled with challenges and obstacles, and yet the thought of proving myself drove me forward. I remember the high school years being the hardest of all, every family gathering a painful reminder of my insignificance, every compliment given to Adil a stab to my growing pride. I kept my feelings buried behind smiles and polite nods, learning to mask the storm of emotions inside me. My teachers recognized my talent in art and writing, yet even they could not protect me from the pervasive shadow of my brother. I sought solace in friendships outside the home, people who saw me for who I was and not in comparison to anyone else. I remember my best friend Layla, who encouraged me to pursue my dreams, who stayed up with me late into the night, helping me refine my work and cheering quietly when I won small competitions. These moments of support were rare, precious, and they strengthened my resolve. I realized that the world beyond my family could offer validation and recognition that my parents refused to give. I made a plan. I would leave after college. I would build something that was mine entirely. My parents could not touch my empire. My brother could not overshadow me, and the world would have no choice but to acknowledge my brilliance. I remember the day I packed my bags, leaving the house for the first time. My parents were indifferent and Adil smug and dismissive as ever. I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, walking away from everything I had known and stepping into the unknown. I knew it would not be easy. I knew I would struggle and that many nights would be spent crying alone, but I also knew that I had a fire inside me that could not be extinguished, a determination born of neglect, of favoritism, of the quiet suffering of a child who was always second to someone else. I carried that fire with me like a secret weapon, a source of strength that no one could ever take away from me. That night, as I sat in my tiny rented room, I made a promise to myself that one day my parents would look at me and see the woman I had become, the empire I had built from nothing, the life I had forged with my own hands, the power I had amassed, and perhaps they would finally understand what they had overlooked for so long. I would not wait for their apology or their recognition. I would create a reality so undeniable that it could not be ignored, and as I drifted to sleep I felt a sense of determination unlike anything I had known before, a quiet but unshakable certainty that I would rise beyond the shadows of my family, that I would become unstoppable, that the little girl who had cried in the corner of her room would one day command respect and admiration, and that the world would finally know my worth. I spent months adjusting to life on my own, learning to navigate the complexities of adulthood and the harsh realities of a world that did not coddle or excuse mediocrity. Every small success became a stepping stone, each failure a lesson. I devoured books on business, on finance, on personal development, soaking in knowledge and applying it meticulously. I began making connections, quietly reaching out to mentors and experts, while Adil continued living off my parents' fortune, oblivious to the world I was building. I remember my first small business venture, selling handmade crafts online. I worked day and night packaging products, writing descriptions, managing sales, and learning the ins and outs of marketing. I faced rejection after rejection, yet each setback only fueled the fire inside me. I began to understand that I had power and persistence and resilience in refusing to give up despite being overlooked, despite being underestimated. Every dollar earned, every positive review, every repeat customer was a silent victory, a quiet revenge against the family that had ignored me. A step closer to the life I envisioned. I began to network with other entrepreneurs, attending seminars, conferences, and workshops, taking every opportunity to learn and grow, slowly building a reputation for reliability, creativity, and determination. I knew that these small steps would lead to something greater, that my time would come, and when it did, it would be undeniable. The journey was long and sometimes lonely, yet every moment reinforced my belief in myself. I had been abandoned by my family, but I had found strength in solitude and ambition in the relentless pursuit of excellence. I had learned that recognition must be earned, not expected, that love may be absent, but self-respect and achievement could fill that void. I was no longer the ignored daughter. I was becoming a force to be reckoned with, someone who would rise from the ashes of favoritism and neglect to claim a place of power and influence, a woman whose worth could not be measured by the flawed perceptions of a family blinded by bias. And so as the years passed and I continued building my skills, knowledge, and business acumen, I carried with me the quiet determination that one day my parents would realize the magnitude of what they had overlooked, that my brother would see that their favoritism had not created greatness in him, but had underestimated the greatness in me, and that the little girl who had once cried alone in a room had grown into a woman unstoppable, unyielding, and destined to shine brighter than anyone had imagined. After leaving home, I was determined to create a life that was entirely my own, a life where I would no longer be defined by favoritism or neglect. Every step I took was deliberate, every choice a building block in the empire I envisioned. I rented a small apartment in a city far from the suffocating shadow of my family. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, and the nights long, but I felt free for the first time in my life, free to pursue my dreams on my own terms. I worked multiple jobs, taking whatever work I could find to pay the rent and support myself, yet I never let these jobs consume me. I used every spare moment to study, to learn, and to create, to hone the skills that would one day make me untouchable. I read books on business strategy, on finance, on marketing, on negotiation, and on leadership, absorbing knowledge like a sponge and applying it meticulously. I attended workshops, seminars, and online courses. I practiced relentlessly and tested myself in every opportunity one could find. The world was harsh and unyielding, and yet it became a proving ground where my resilience and determination could shine. I remember the nights I stayed awake crafting products for my first small business project, carefully measuring, cutting, and assembling with precision and care. I would package them in the early hours of the morning and ship them myself, learning from each mistake and celebrating each success, small as it seemed. The first positive feedback from a customer filled me with exhilaration. I realized that recognition did not have to come from my parents or my brother, that the world beyond my family could see my worth and appreciate my talent. I began networking quietly, building connections with mentors and other entrepreneurs, seeking advice and learning from their successes and failures. I invested the little money I had in tools and materials, researching markets and trends, observing what people valued and how I could provide something unique. I learned to manage finances, to budget and reinvest, to maximize growth. Slowly, I began to see my efforts take shape in tangible results, small at first, then larger and more promising. My confidence grew alongside my skills, and every obstacle I faced became an opportunity to learn and improve. I began experimenting with marketing strategies, creating visually appealing presentations for my products, crafting messages that resonated with potential customers. I discovered the power of storytelling, of conveying emotion and value in a way that drew people in and made them care about what I had to offer. I worked tirelessly late into the night, fueled by determination and the quiet memory of every moment I had been ignored, every compliment withheld, every opportunity given to my brother that had been denied to me. I was no longer seeking validation from my family. I was seeking mastery from myself and the satisfaction of building something meaningful from nothing. I remember the day I made my first significant profit from my business. I was sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by stacks of products and invoices, and I felt a surge of pride unlike anything I had experienced before. This was my creation, my achievement, my proof that I could thrive without the support of anyone who had once doubted me. I realized that success was sweeter when it was earned through persistence and self-reliance. I began to expand, gradually hiring a small team of freelancers to help with production, marketing, and customer service, delegating tasks, carefully learning the importance of leadership and trust. One discovered that building an empire was not just about money, but about relationship, strategy, and vision. I started exploring opportunities for investment, partnerships, and collaborations, leveraging my growing reputation and network to open doors that had once seemed impossible. Every rejection I faced was a lesson, every failure a step closer to refinement and eventual success. I remember the first time I presented my brand at a local expo, my booth modest yet carefully designed, and every interaction I had with potential clients and investors sharpened my confidence and understanding. I learned to speak with authority, to convey passion and competence, to show that I was serious and capable. I began receiving inquiries from buyers interested in bulk orders and from mentors offering guidance and advice. I invested in professional development and tools to streamline operations and increase efficiency. Slowly, I transformed my small side business into a growing company, one that could operate independently and scale. I began to envision a larger enterprise with multiple product lines, a loyal customer base, and a brand identity that resonated with people. I realized that my childhood of neglect and favoritism had given me a unique perspective, a relentless drive, and an understanding of the value of self-sufficiency. I began taking calculated risks, investing in marketing campaigns, developing new products, and expanding distribution channels. Each success built upon the last, and my confidence and my abilities grew exponentially. I remember the first time I hired my first full-time employee, a young woman eager to learn. I felt a sense of responsibility and pride guiding her training and watching her grow alongside the company. I learned that leadership required patience, empathy, and vision, and that empowering others was a critical component of building something lasting. I began attending networking events, business summits, and conferences, meeting influential figures and learning from their strategies and failures. I refined my business plan, created financial projections, and developed long-term goals. I leveraged social media to build a following and create engagement, connecting with potential clients and collaborators globally. I discovered the importance of branding, consistency, quality, and customer experience. I learned to adapt quickly, to changes in the market to anticipate trends and respond with innovation. I remember the first time my company broke into a major regional market, the sense of accomplishment overwhelming as I realized that the girl who had cried alone in her room years ago had now created a business capable of competing on a larger scale. I began mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing knowledge and guidance while continuing to expand my empire. I realized that the journey of building something meaningful was ongoing and required constant growth, learning, and adaptation. I faced challenges from competitors, from market fluctuations, from internal issues, and yet each obstacle strengthened my resolve. I learned to make difficult decisions, to prioritize long-term goals over short-term comfort, and to trust my instincts when navigating uncertainty. I began to see the transformation within myself, the timid, overlooked girl of my youth, now a confident, capable woman with a clear vision and purpose. I reflected on the years of struggle, the tears, the rejection, and the isolation, and understood that they had forged resilience, determination, and ingenuity within me. I began creating systems and processes to scale the company, efficiently developing departments and training programs, ensuring that the growth of the business was sustainable. I remembered the countless nights of doubt when I questioned whether I was capable of achieving my dreams, and I smiled knowing that every step forward was proof that I was far stronger than I had ever imagined. I started to receive recognition from industry leaders, media outlets, and customers alike, a validation that was once denied to me, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of proving, not to my parents or brother, but to myself, that I could thrive and succeed beyond their expectations. I continued to invest in knowledge, expanding into new areas, learning about finance, technology, marketing, and leadership, constantly refining my approach and adapting to change. I established long-term relationships with investors and partners who shared my vision and supported my growth. I remember the day I signed my first major contract with a multinational company, a moment of triumph and realization that the empire I had dreamed of was within reach. Each contract, each partnership, each expansion was a step closer to the life I had imagined in my childhood. I began to strategize for further growth, exploring new markets, industries, and innovations. I hired specialists to optimize operations and create new opportunities. One developed marketing campaigns that told a story of passion, resilience, and quality, connecting with customers on a deeper emotional level. I reflected on the contrast between my past and present, the little girl who had cried in silence versus the woman commanding respect and influence. I realized that revenge was not merely about proving others wrong, but about rising above limitations and creating undeniable success. I started building a strong company culture, one based on respect, collaboration, and excellence, fostering a team that shared my vision and values. I ensured that every decision aligned with the long-term goals and integrity of the business. I remembered the countless obstacles I had overcome, the sleepless nights, the financial struggles, the emotional pain, and understood that each challenge had been a training ground, shaping me into a capable leader, a strategic thinker, and a resilient visionary. I continued to innovate constantly, exploring new products, services, and experiences. I ensured that the company not only thrived financially but also created value for customers, employees, and partners alike. I reflected on the distance I had traveled from the neglected daughter in my parents' house to the founder of a growing enterprise, and felt an immense sense of pride and satisfaction. I knew that the journey was far from over, that challenges would continue to arise, and yet I was prepared, equipped with knowledge, determination, and experience to overcome any obstacle. I remembered my promise to myself to rise above the shadows, to build something remarkable, and I smiled knowing that the foundation of my empire was now solid and that the world would soon recognize the power and brilliance of the woman. By the time I had firmly established my business, I had grown into a woman far beyond the girl my parents and brother had ignored. I had a team, I had clients, I had influence, and yet the fire inside me for recognition and the desire for justice had not dimmed. I remembered every moment of dismissal, every stolen glance for my brother, every polite but meaningless pat on the head I had endured, and I resolved that the time had come for the world, including my family, to acknowledge what I had built in silence. And with determination I began planning carefully, not out of malice, but out of a desire to demonstrate the power of resilience and the consequence of neglect. I started by expanding my company into areas where my brother had already invested. I knew his ventures were mediocre because he had never needed to fight for success. He had always relied on my parents' resources, and I saw an opportunity to outshine him in his own realm. I poured time and resources into research, development, and strategic marketing, crafting campaigns that would highlight innovation, quality, and vision. I launched products that captured the market attention and rapidly gained customers who once favored my brother for convenience and habit. I watched as his confidence wavered when he realized that his ventures could not compete with the quality and strategy of my company. He began to make mistakes under Pressure decisions that once seemed trivial now had consequences, and I observed silently, knowing that the seeds of change had been planted. I continued my strategy by networking in circles where my brother had previously been considered influential. I attended conferences, workshops, and gatherings where he had held an edge, building relationships with potential clients, partners, and investors, showing my competence and vision. With clarity and authority, I leveraged every opportunity to demonstrate my expertise and reliability, and soon the market began to shift its attention from his name to mine. I remember the first time my parents reached out to me after a major public achievement of my company. The press coverage, extensive and glowing, they called to ask advice, to understand how I had achieved success, and to learn from my expertise. I listened politely and offered guidance, yet inside I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the same family that had dismissed my efforts now sought counsel from the woman they had ignored for years. I continued to grow my business, establishing subsidiaries, acquiring smaller competitors, and expanding into international markets, creating a network of influence that my brother could not match. I hired top talent, experts in finance, marketing, and operations, and worked alongside them closely, ensuring that every decision aligned with my vision and long-term strategy. One invested in innovation and research, developing products and services that redefined the industry standards. I organized public events, launches, and press conferences that showcased my achievements, my presentations confident, polished, and compelling, leaving audiences impressed and competitors in awe. I strategically outmaneuvered my brother in deals, negotiations, and client relations. I made offers that were attractive, smart, and sustainable, leaving him scrambling to compete. I watched as his reputation suffered due to his negligence, arrogance, and reliance on my parents' support. I began appearing in business magazines, interviews, and industry articles, telling my story of perseverance and vision, of starting from nothing and building an empire alone. The media loved the narrative of the underestimated woman rising above the shadows, and my story gained traction across the city, across the nation, and eventually globally. I noticed a shift in perception in the way people spoke about my brother and me. The respect I had earned was undeniable, and his confidence began to crumble. I continued to expand, strategically acquiring businesses my brother had intended to buy. I outbid him, negotiated faster, and presented better terms. Every victory a quiet demonstration of the consequences of his complacency. I remained professional, composed, and polite in public interactions, never stooping to sabotage or unprofessional behavior. I let results speak for themselves, and they shouted loudly. I remember the first time I attended a family gathering after my company had made headlines. My parents' eyes wide with surprise, my brother standing awkwardly trying to appear confident. I felt a strange mixture of pity and satisfaction. I did not gloat, I did not taunt, I simply existed fully as myself, the successful, capable woman they had ignored. I answered questions about my company, about my achievements, calmly, clearly, and with authority, showing them the reality of my power and influence without saying a word about their past favoritism. I began to notice subtle changes in their behavior, a hesitation in their words, a newfound respect in their eyes, and a quiet admiration that they could not openly express. I realized that revenge was not about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about proving that neglect, underestimation, and favoritism had consequences, that the person who had been overlooked could rise far beyond expectations. I strategically invited potential investors and influential figures to family events under the guise of casual visits, allowing them to witness my confidence, competence, and charisma firsthand. I knew that my parents and brother could not deny the impact of my presence and achievements. I continued to make business moves that outperformed and outshone my brother in every sector where we competed. I secured partnerships and collaborations that expanded my influence beyond the city and into international markets. I meticulously documented achievements, milestones, and accolades, creating a narrative of relentless effort and undeniable success. I began mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing insights and strategies while continuing to build my empire, reinforcing my image as a leader and visionary. I ensured that every public appearance, every presentation, and every interview communicated my dedication, intelligence, and capability, leaving no room for doubt. I watched as my brother grew frustrated, increasingly making mistakes and poor decisions, his arrogance diminishing and his confidence waning, while my parents began seeking my advice and validation. I remained calm, professional, and composed, demonstrating the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege. I organized charity events, sponsored community programs, and engaged in social initiatives, creating a reputation not only for business acumen but also for integrity, vision, and social responsibility. I ensured that my public image was impeccable while my brother struggled to maintain relevance and credibility. I strategically launched a major product line that directly competed with one of his ventures, gaining market share rapidly and drawing public attention. I carefully managed marketing campaigns to highlight innovation, quality, and customer focus, creating a contrast between his lack of preparation and my deliberate planning and execution. I began to receive invitations to speak at global forums, conferences, and summits, sharing my journey of resilience and vision, inspiring countless individuals. I realized that my revenge was not personal vindictiveness, but the undeniable demonstration of my ability to rise above neglected adversity and underestimation. I continued to expand into multiple sectors, securing contracts, partnerships, and collaborations that solidified my influence and wealth. I hired legal and financial experts to protect and manage my growing empire, ensuring sustainability and long-term growth. I observed the growing respect and admiration from peers, industry leaders, and even former skeptics, recognizing the culmination of my relentless effort and vision. I strategically acquired media coverage, highlighting milestones and achievements, demonstrating the journey from obscurity to prominence. I maintained meticulous records of my achievements, accolades, and public appearances, creating a legacy that would endure beyond my personal involvement. I continue to innovate, explore new markets, and expand influence, building a network of relationships that extended across industries and borders. I reinforced my leadership qualities, inspiring loyalty, respect, and trust from my team and partners. I carefully monitored the impact of my decisions on competitors, including my brother, ensuring that strategic advantages were leveraged effectively. I began receiving invitations to participate in philanthropic ventures and public speaking engagements, amplifying my public presence and reinforcing the narrative of perseverance and achievement. I strategically positioned my brand and persona to reflect the values of resilience, intelligence, and innovation, leaving a lasting impression on all who encountered me. I watched as my brother attempted to recover his reputation and ventures, yet every move he made was reactive and insufficient against the proactive strategy and preparation I had cultivated. I continued to strengthen my company culture, building a team capable of innovation, leadership, and strategic growth, reinforcing my long-term vision. I engaged in mentorship programs for aspiring entrepreneurs, creating influence and loyalty beyond the scope of my company, further solidifying my legacy. I leveraged media appearances, publications, and interviews to share my journey, inspiring others while subtly demonstrating the consequences of underestimating and neglecting potential. I observed the transformation in my parents and brother, their attitudes shifting from dismissive to respectful, acknowledging achievements they had once ignored. I realized that the ultimate revenge was not destruction, humiliation, or confrontation, but rising above limitations and achieving undeniable success. I continued to expand into international markets, launching campaigns and securing partnerships that further enhanced influence and reputation. I maintained unwavering focus, discipline, and strategic planning, ensuring that every move aligned with long-term objectives. I developed systems for scalability, sustainability, and efficiency, reinforcing the structure and strength of my growing empire. I documented my journey, milestones, achievements, and key decisions, creating a legacy and roadmap for future endeavors. I witnessed the changing perception of my family, peers, competitors, and the public, recognizing the culmination of years of effort, persistence, and resilience. I embraced the responsibility of leadership, influence, and vision. Continuing to grow both personally and professionally, I reflected on the journey from neglected daughter to industry leader, from overlooked sibling to powerhouse entrepreneur, understanding that true revenge lay in undeniable achievement, recognition, and respect. I remained composed, confident, and strategic in all interactions, maintaining professionalism, authority, and influence, establishing a narrative of resilience, perseverance, and triumph that left an indelible mark on everyone around me. I watched as my brother struggled to regain footing and relevance while I continued to rise, expand, and influence, demonstrating the stark contrast between inherited privilege and earned success. I engaged in strategic partnerships, global ventures, and public initiatives, reinforcing the strength, scope, and sustainability of my empire. I maintained meticulous planning, documentation, and monitoring, ensuring alignment with long-term goals, vision, and legacy. I continued to innovate, lead, and inspire, building a lasting influence that transcended personal grievances and established authority, credibility, and power. I observed the transformation in my family, their recognition, admiration, and respect gradually aligning with the reality of my achievements and presence. I realized that the culmination of years of resilience, effort, strategy, and perseverance had created a powerful narrative and undeniable outcome that established my dominance, competence, and legacy, and ensured that my journey from overlooked neglected daughter to empowered, influential woman was complete, undeniable, and celebrated. Standing in the top floor of my skyscraper office overlooking the city I had built with my own hands, I felt a profound sense of triumph and liberation. The little girl who had once cried in the corner of her childhood bedroom had transformed into a powerful woman whose vision, ambition, and resilience could not be denied. I remembered the nights of tears, of frustration, and of being overlooked, the countless moments of doubt when I questioned whether I could ever rise above the shadows of my family, and yet here I stood, stronger, wiser, and unstoppable. I had created an empire that spanned multiple industries, regions, and countries, built entirely on my determination, intelligence, and perseverance. I had learned that true power did not come from wealth alone, but from knowledge, strategy, vision, and the ability to inspire and lead others. I reflected on my journey from being neglected by my parents to becoming a woman whose influence was recognized globally and whose success had become undeniable. I watched as my team worked efficiently around me, executing plans, expanding operations, and innovating in ways that reinforced the strength and sustainability of my empire. I had invested in leadership development, mentoring programs, and organizational culture, ensuring that my company not only thrived financially but also nurtured talent, fostered loyalty, and promoted excellence. I remembered the countless moments I had been dismissed, ignored, or compared unfavorably to my brother, and realized that those experiences had forged resilience, courage, and ingenuity within me. I had used the pain of neglect as fuel to rise higher and achieve more than anyone could have imagined. I had built systems, processes, and networks that ensured long-term growth, stability, and influence, allowing my empire to continue expanding beyond my personal involvement. I had acquired businesses my brother had once hoped to control, established partnerships with global leaders and investors, and created a brand synonymous with innovation, quality, and integrity. I reflected on the subtle shifts in my family, their admiration and respect that had grown slowly over time as they witnessed my undeniable achievements. I realized that the ultimate victory was not in humiliating them or proving them wrong, but in achieving greatness beyond their comprehension. I had built a reality in which my worth could not be questioned, my power could not be ignored, and my influence was absolute. I walked through my office, interacting with employees, partners, and clients, observing the respect, admiration, and loyalty they showed me, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction that extended beyond material wealth or recognition. I had created a culture of excellence where ideas were valued, innovation was rewarded, and leadership was cultivated. I remembered the girl who had once dreamed quietly from a corner of her home and understood that the foundation of this empire was not merely ambition but resilience, determination, and the unwavering belief in oneself. I continued to expand my reach into new markets, developing products and services that disrupted industries, set new standards, and captured the attention of global consumers. I had cultivated a network of influence that extended across continents and industries, creating a legacy of power, respect, and authority that would endure for years to come. I had mastered strategy, negotiation, leadership, and vision, applying these skills to create a company capable of thriving even in the most competitive and challenging environments. I reflected on the moments when my brother had scoffed at my efforts, when my parents had ignored my achievements, and realized that their underestimation had been a catalyst for my success. I had learned that adversity, neglect, and favoritism could be transformed into motivation, determination, and a relentless drive to excel. I observed the impact of my leadership on my team, watching them grow, develop, innovate, and achieve alongside me, understanding that the true measure of success lay not only in personal achievement but also in the empowerment of others. I had strategically expanded my brand through media coverage, global partnerships, philanthropic initiatives, and public speaking engagements, creating influence, recognition, and credibility that solidified my legacy. I watched as industry leaders, peers, and global audiences recognized my achievements, my strategy, my vision, and my unwavering commitment to excellence. I reflected on the moments of doubt, fear, and struggle that had once seemed insurmountable, and understood that they had shaped me into a resilient visionary capable of overcoming any obstacle. I had meticulously cultivated relationships with investors, partners, clients, and global leaders, ensuring the growth, sustainability, and influence of my empire. I had established processes and systems that allowed my business to operate efficiently, scale rapidly, and maintain consistent quality. I continued to innovate, explore emerging trends, invest in talent, and expand influence, ensuring that my company remained at the forefront of industries and markets. I observed the transformation in my parents and brother as they slowly recognized the magnitude of what I had achieved, their admiration and respect now genuine and inevitable. I realized that the ultimate form of revenge and triumph was not in retaliation but in becoming someone so powerful, competent, and successful that the world could not ignore me. I had created a legacy of resilience, vision, excellence, and leadership that would endure far beyond my personal involvement. I walked through the halls of my company, observing the culture of innovation, collaboration, and respect that I had nurtured, knowing that every employee, every project, every achievement was part of the empire I had built from the ground up. I reflected on the journey from neglected daughter to empowered leader, understanding that the trials, the pain, and the rejection had been necessary ingredients in the creation of this unstoppable force. I continued to expand into global markets, develop strategic partnerships, and cultivate talent, ensuring that my influence and success would remain unshakable. I had established a reputation for integrity, excellence, and vision that inspired employees, clients, partners, and competitors alike. I remembered the moments of struggle, sacrifice, and determination that had defined my journey, and realized that each challenge had contributed to the strength, resilience, and clarity of purpose that now defined me. I had become a symbol of empowerment, achievement, and perseverance, showing the world that neglect and underestimation could be transformed into unstoppable success. I watched as my brother struggled to adapt, compete, and regain relevance, recognizing that the world had shifted and that I had risen beyond the reach of his influence. I maintained composure, professionalism, and strategic focus, demonstrating the contrast between inherited privilege and earned accomplishment. I had cultivated a team capable of sustaining and growing my empire, ensuring continuity, excellence, and influence. I engaged in continuous learning, exploration, and innovation, pushing boundaries and setting new standards across industries and markets. I had created a global presence, a powerful brand, and a legacy of resilience, determination, and triumph that would endure for generations. I reflected on the distance I had traveled from the overlooked child to the empowered woman, understanding that true victory was in the creation of an undeniable reality, a life of influence, respect, and achievement that no one could diminish. I continued to expand my influence through strategic initiatives, global partnerships, and public engagement, ensuring that my empire remained dynamic, influential, and enduring. I observed the admiration, recognition, and respect from peers, leaders, and the public, appreciating that my journey from obscurity, neglect, and underestimation had culminated in undeniable triumph. I had mastered leadership, strategy, negotiation, innovation, and vision, applying these skills to every decision and action, ensuring long-term growth, stability, and influence. I reflected on my personal growth, transformation, and empowerment, understanding that the ultimate liberation lay in self-realization, achievement, and the creation of an enduring legacy. I watched as my empire thrived, expanded, and influenced global markets, industries, and people, leaving an indelible mark on the world that could not be ignored or diminished. I maintained focus, discipline, strategic planning, and execution, ensuring that my vision and influence continued to grow and strengthen. I had become the embodiment of resilience, determination, excellence, and empowerment, showing the world that true strength and triumph came not from favor or inheritance, but from relentless pursuit of vision and mastery of self. I reflected on the journey from neglected daughter to influential leader, understanding that the ultimate revenge, liberation, and satisfaction was in creating a life, empire, and legacy that stood as undeniable proof of my worth, power, and resilience. I watched the city lights below my office windows and felt the quiet satisfaction of having transformed my pain, neglect, and adversity into an empire of respect, influence, and achievement that would endure long after I was gone. I understood that the girl who had once cried in silence had become unstoppable, recognized, admired, and empowered, and that nothing could ever diminish the empire I had built or the legacy I had created.